We're here today to talk about something dear to me, the container world, and just some terminology for those of you that may not know. We refer to TU, that's a 20-foot equivalent unit, or a container if you like. What's the other one? Liner. So there's a few references to liner here. So when we talk about liner, we're talking about trade. So non-bulk trade, if you like. So stuff that, consumer goods, manufacturing goods that used to go in the hold of the ship, but now most of it gets containerised nowadays. So look, pre-containerisation, that's what pretty much what the hold of a vessel used to look like. Particularly on the right-hand side there, that's like a ship that came in the 60s. And you can see that, well, the 1960s that is, and you can see like how all the cargo's basically just thrown into the hold. There is some order about it because they've got to stow it according to what port they're going to next, but you can see what's involved as far as, if you look at that picture down the bottom left-hand corner of ships discharging. It was actually in Port Adelaide in the 1940s, but see the amount of movement involved, like to discharge it from the ship, to put it in the quay line, the next move is into the shed, then it goes onto the back of the truck, and then from the truck it goes to the importer's premises. So pretty much there's 5 or 6 movements involved with that. To get it, to the importer's premises, and then that's duplicated again to get it into the store. So very inefficient, very labour intensive. It's open for pilfering and breakage of cargo. So it worked that way for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it was generally accepted that Malcolm McLean, so he's based on the east coast of the US, was the founder, if you like, of containerisation. He was actually a truck driver that got annoyed at the delays on the wharf waiting for the waterside workers to get it wasn't their fault, it was just the inefficient way of handling cargo. So he came up with the concept of containerisation. That's the Ideal X. That was the first vessel that departed Newark in 1956 and went to Houston carrying 58 containers, and that officially was the first container vessel. It wasn't actually a container vessel, it was a converted World War II tanker, as most of the container ships were in the early days. It wasn't really until the late 60s that they started to get organised and build purpose-built container vessels. I've got a 2-minute video. It's a few years old, and it's American. But it gives you just a quick overview of containerisation and how it came about.
This is the Empire State Building. With 102 floors, it's one of the tallest buildings in the US. But it's 4 floors shorter than the MSC Oscar, which isn't a building, but a boat, the largest container ship in the world. Launched in January 2015, the MSC Oscar is nearly the size of 4 football fields laid end to end. It has a draft of 16 meters, which means that if you were to stand at the bottom of the ship, you'd be 5 stories underwater. It's one of 5,000 container ships crossing the world's oceans, carrying the vast majority of products you buy and the parts those products were made from. These ships are the engine of the global economy, but 60 years ago, they didn't even exist. How did all this happen? For hundreds of years, shipping was a bit of a nightmare. Goods had to be individually unloaded into storage at ports, then individually packed onto ships and unpacked afterwards. This process was painfully slow and expensive, and it left items vulnerable to damage and theft. In 1956, Malcolm McLean, an American trucking executive, proved that you could save time and money by loading truck containers directly onto ships. On the other side, they'd be put back onto trucks or trains and reach their destination without ever being opened. McLean later got the government on board by using containerized service to help the military provide supplies for the Vietnam War.
Some of the more notable innovations in solving the logistical problems in Vietnam have been in the field of containerization.
After the industry recognized how efficient container shipping was, the use of container ships exploded. International standardization was the key. The unit of measurement is TEU, or 20-foot equivalent. Most containers used today are twice as long. Shippers quickly realized that the larger the boat, the cheaper the shipping price per container, so the size of the largest ships has grown exponentially. In 1999, a shipping executive predicted an eventual ceiling of 12,000 TEU, but the MSC Oscar has a capacity of over 19,000. To accommodate these huge ships, ports have been rebuilt, with vast yards to store the containers and huge cranes to load and unload them simultaneously in a specific order. Today's biggest ships are so huge that they can't actually fit through the Panama Canal or dock at any American port. They're mostly used for shipping between Europe and Asia. It's hard to overstate how much all this has transformed the world economy. After containerization, global trade in merchandise soared, while insurance costs and inventories decreased. Jobs at ports and in factories in the US dropped, while consumers gained access to a greater variety of goods at a lower price. As a result, products we buy can be made with parts from several different countries by people on the other side of the world. And it's hard to imagine any of this happening without someone first deciding to put the stuff in a box and put the box on a boat.
Yeah, so a pretty simple concept, but it kind of did change things quite dramatically. By the mid-60s, there was 3 container operations working in the world. There was on the east coast, the Malcolm McLean Sea Land Service, and there was a couple operating on the west coast of the US. We had one in Australia operating between Sydney, Melbourne and Fremantle, just a coastal service. And these ships were actually built in Australia as container ships, so we can lay claim that we built the first container ships in the world, but that was a very small operation. I think when they did, they were operating with non-standard equipment, so those containers you see at the right-hand side there at the top, they were 18 foot, there was nothing standard about them, so it wasn't until they really standardised everything that things started to take off. You know that on those ships too, they had the cranes on the ships rather than alongside, so that was generally the way it was done in the very early days. It wasn't until the 70s that started to change it. They had shoreside cranes. So in the UK, back in those days, like that, the main trade lanes for Australia was pretty much the UK and a little bit of Europe. We had no trade or very little trade with Asia. And the ship owners in the UK in particular that were operating these trades were getting very annoyed at the Australian trades because it was a long voyage time. When the ships got to Australia, they were delayed in port. Typically for a conventional liner ship to come to Australia, it was normal that you'd be 60% at sea, 40% in port. In Australia, even with that long voyage time, it was flipped around the other way. It was 60% of the time they were spent in port and 40% at sea. When you consider that's a 40-day transit between Europe and Australia, it was very inefficient and very costly. When the ship's not moving and it's in port, it's actually costing money, it's not generating money. So a group of ship owners in the UK got together and they formed a company called OCL. They couldn't all do it on their own. They had to merge as an alliance, if you like, because the cost to do this type of thing, and it was at this stage had been done nowhere else in the world. And they decided to build 6 ships. And you see the comment down the bottom there by the designer. I'll read it out just in case you can't read it. Of all the trades operated by the partners in OCL, it was not difficult to decide on the Australian run for the deployment of the first fully containerised vessels. Due to the extended port delays and sheer obstructiveness of the waterside labour, this is where the greatest gain could be made. So within the first voyage that it did, when they did containerise in 1969, they cut the voyage time down from 74 days to 35 days, so it was dramatic cost saving overnight. These vessels were called the Encounter Bay class vessels, and so they were named after Australian bays. They're all Australian bays, those 6 ships there. So the original 6 set of ships that were purpose built for containerisation were called the Encounter Bay class vessels, which is Encounter Bay, our Encounter Bay down. So since then there's been 12,000. They were the first of 12,000 vessels that have since followed. Not only did they have to design the ships, but they had to build all the container handling equipment, design the containers, the cranes. It was completely new, and it was a big risk in the sense that they weren't sure whether it was even going to work. So there's a lot involved to just containerisation. Looks like a simple thing, but behind the scenes, there was a lot to do. So benefits for containerisation is reduced time in port. As I said, the Europe to Australia run was reduced from 75 down to 35 days. This allowed as many as 4 additional voyages per year, which is a massive cost saving. The other thing was those container ships replaced what was the equivalent of 3 conventional liner vessels. So there was less crew required. With containerisation, a gang of 10 men would take 3 minutes to move a 20-tonne container, compared with conventional methods which would require 30 men 1 hour to move the same amount of cargo. So that's massive in the scheme of things. Manning levels on the ships were drastically reduced, and there was less damage and pilfering. Wasn't all good news though. There was there was a lot of negative things about or disadvantage to do with containerisation. There's massive capital outlay for the ship owners to build a fleet of ships, the containers, the cranes, the terminals that were required to handle it. It was as an unproven concept, so it was, if it didn't work, they would have invested billions of dollars for no reason. The other thing was that the trade between Australia and the UK in particular was all one way, so it was all imports coming in, so they were shipping fresh air back in those containers back to the UK. Some social consequences, some of the vibrant port cities were decimated when containerisation came in. Normally they required like intermodal or rail and decent road setup, so they moved them away from the traditional ports. So cities that were built around ports kind of died, and no different to really what's happened here to a degree. And probably the biggest impact, there was a massive loss of jobs on the waterfront. You can see it's a bit hard to read there. I'm sorry, I thought this was going to be on a projector screen, but that dark blue line on the top right hand side is the labour headcount. It went down from 3,000 people around about between 1970 and 75. This is in Adelaide. Down to less than 500 people in the space of 2 or 3 years. So there was massive job losses. That's an early concept plan of the container terminal at Outer Harbour, complete with a helipad. So this was well before it was ever built. It's quite funny to see some of the plans that they had. Well, it was good that they actually did have plans, but I mentioned earlier that some of those photos that you saw on some of those early slides was actually Fremantle. There was 3 ports in Australia that geared up for containerisation: Fremantle, Melbourne, Sydney. Adelaide didn't, and Brisbane didn't. A little bit more on that later. You can see at the time there was a number of things going on with the Department of Marine and Harbours. They wanted to build a passenger terminal because up until that point, immigration had been a big thing in Adelaide. They were having as many as, I think it was about 70 odd, passenger liners. Now these weren't cruise liners like we know today. These were immigrants. So 10-pound poms that were coming through, but they were all processed through that little rusty shed in the left-hand corner up until the 1970s. A bit hard to read that again, but in 1970, instead of building the container terminal, they decided to build the passenger terminal. You can see the top photo on the left-hand side, but a bit hard to see again. The passenger terminal under construction, where the container terminal would be, is still vacant. By the 1980s, that passenger terminal was not receiving a single call per year. It's easy to say in hindsight, but from what we read, they basically had, in those days we had, Marine Harbours actually had a minister for Marine Harbours was Des Corcoran. He allocated $2 million, which wasn't enough to build a container terminal, so they had the money in the budget and they built a passenger terminal instead. Mm-hmm. The other thing that was happening was the offices were split. They had apparently 2 offices in the city, 1 office down here in Port Adelaide. They wanted to put everyone together, so they built this monstrosity across the road. So the focus was probably not on what should have been. It's ironic in one way because in 1959, the then General Manager for Marine Harbours, or Harbours Board as it was called in those days, actually went and visited Malcolm McLean and witnessed the unitisation on the East Coast. Come back, wrote a report, said we need to gear up for this new way of handling cargo, but it was never acted on. So again, a bit hard to see, but that's the port, the inner harbour in the mid-60s, and I think there's, if you count up the ship, there's about 13 or 14 ships in there by the mid-70s. Aside from those Navy ships that berthed 1 there in the inner harbour, there's only three other ships in port, and that's pretty much a sign of the times. What happened when the rest of Australia containerised? It kind of opened up competition. Melbourne took all of our cargo. So we went from having all the liner services that every other port in Australia had. In those days, we were behind Melbourne and Sydney as far as throughput was concerned, but equal Brisbane and ahead of Fremantle. But overnight, we lost every liner service. Everything went on rail between Melbourne and Adelaide, and that comes as a shock to a lot of people because in the old days, you captive area of cargo, and that never changed. Like there was a long way to Melbourne. You weren't going to cart it to Melbourne to load it loose on a ship. Whereas containerisation lowered the cost that much that true competition between ports started. And between, from containerisation in 1969 through to 1981, we lost virtually every, we didn't get another direct call until 1981 when we got a European call back. So in those days, everything was moving. Small volumes of containers that we did have moved through the railroad berth at 25. We used to run, bottom right-hand corner there, you can see a train out of harbour. We actually used to, the terminal wasn't servicing ships, it was servicing trains from Melbourne. So that went on for the best part of 10 years until we started to peak back some of that volume. You can see into the 90s, it was kind of or 80s and 90s really, it was 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We'd gain a service, so we'd have a big leap of 20% volume, then we'd lose the service, so we'd go backwards. So it was really, really cyclical. It's really only been in the last 20 years where we still lose services and gain services, but it's not as dramatic as what it was in those early days.
Who owned the terminal back then, Pete?
So it was Transocean Terminal. So we're not blaming Department of Marine Harbours, or they would have built the berth, but it would have been an operator. So Transocean Terminals in those days was actually owned by those line operators. So OCL owned terminals. There was another one, ACTA, which they owned terminals, or Transocean Terminals as well. So it was actually the line operators that ran the terminals. But you can see down the bottom right-hand corner, very little activity, and it sat there for 4 years pretty much with a labour force and no ships to service. Again, I'm sorry about the size of this. I didn't realise it was going to be on such a small screen. But so today, where we are, don't ignore up the top, just down the bottom there. We did in the last financial year, 2018-19, we did 420,000 containers through the port. On the right-hand side, that scaling down graph represents our clawback of leakage. So I'll get up here in front. So that high point there, that's about 120,000 containers, and the year is 2008. That's what used to go on rail to and from Melbourne. So we managed to claw that back over the years, not necessarily through any good work that we've done. It's probably more to do with market forces, to be honest. You can see it's having to jump back up again just in the last financial year.
Is there advantage in us driving it one way or another moving forward?
A lot of it, to be honest, Rand, was out of our control. Like it's not. We're kind of. But when we had that win there, but by clawing it back, that was actually the GFC. I won't go into, that's a whole other story, right? That I won't go into the economics of it, but actually when the rest of Australia was going backwards, we were actually going forward because of market forces, but we haven't got time for that today. So we still do have leakage to Melbourne, and that's a hangover really from those days when we didn't have the services. Pretty much nowadays it comes back to what service we do and don't have. For example, we don't have an East Coast USA service, so a large chunk of that volume that goes to Melbourne is East Coast USA, some time-sensitive North Asian cargo. That's basically it. But you see, this slide just shows the evolution of container growth. I got that slide on the left-hand side off the internet, so I don't think it's just scaled correctly because they've got the encounter bay right up the very top there, which is in fact 200 metres long. The biggest one, the MSC Gulson down the bottom right-hand corner, is 400 metres long. I don't think that's half the size, but you get the idea anyway. So that was the encounter bay up the top. That's the first vessel, first containerised vessel. The Gulson, that was MSC Gulson, was only launched a couple of weeks back. And even from that video that we watched a minute ago, they were talking about 19,000 TU as that MSC Oscar, whatever it is. We've already jumped in the space of 3 years. We've jumped another 4,000 TU ahead of that. So it's.
And can that travel through the Panama Canal?
No. So.
Too wide.
I'm glad you asked.
Sorry about that.
So you can see that the light. We look at the graph, top left-hand corner now. So that the light blue represents the size of ships calling Australia, compared to the rest of the world is the dark blue. So the Maersk Skarstind, that's this baby here that came, she called in July. That was the biggest one we've had to date. And it technically shouldn't have called because we hadn't finished dredging and it was, outside of port rules, but we got 9,400 TEU vessel in. MSC Gulson, as I said, 23,000 TEU. So Panama Canal, the Maersk Skarstind could fit through the new locks in the Panama Canal. For those of you that may not understand the relevance of the Panama Canal, that used to dictate the size of ships. No one ever built a ship bigger than what was the old locks dimensions, which was 32 metres by 300 metres. That was the biggest ship you'd ever see because they had to get through the Panama Canal. But nowadays they've got ships like this ship here would operates between Asia. It's probably only about 6 ports in the world it can call. It operates between Asia and Europe. That's it. Doesn't touch US. US ports can't handle it, nor could we handle that if it was to decide to call here. It couldn't go through the new locks in the Panama Canal. When they started designing the locks about 10 years back for the new Panama Canal, they figured they'd future-proof it for the next 20 years, 30 years, and by the time they were built, and already, they couldn't fit the biggest ships in the world. So we're looking at global trade now. I'm sorry we haven't got a heading up the top there, but so this is what in 2018 global trade equaled 817 million containers, of which 2/3 of that is all Asian-based origin or destination. So that little segment that's missing on the right-hand side there is Australia. That represents 1% of global trade. So we do 8.2 million containers per annum, of which we do 5% of the Australian trade. So Adelaide, to give you some perspective, we're 0.05% of global trade and less than 5% of 1%. So we're nothing which is and it's quite, I've happened to stumble across this when I was kind of looking up some stuff on the internet. This is world port rankings from 1971. You see Oakland, we're speaking in thousands of containers over here. So Oakland was the biggest port in the world, 336,000 TEU. They're all dominated by either US, European, or believe it or not, Australia. So Melbourne ranked 8th in 1971. Sydney ranked, and that was Sydney Harbour in those days, not Botany. Sydney ranked 20th. So all the only Asian port in the mix was Kobe, which was 19th at 90,000 TEU. If you look at it now, so the top 10 ports in the world, there's only one non-Asian, that's Los Angeles. So Asian ports represent 83% of the total throughput, non-Asian 17%. Melbourne ranked at 59, Sydney 72, Brisbane 129, and it starts to get difficult to measure beyond that, but they reckon Fremantle around 186, and a rough estimate for Adelaide would be around the 240, 250 mark. So that the whole dynamic of shipping has changed in that time frame, with the Asian ports coming to the fore. And this is the growth of containerisation, and you can see China joined the World Trade Organisation in 2001. You can see the steep increase beyond that. I think we've done here, but I thought I'd just slip this one in before we finish. So this is the port of Shanghai. So Shanghai is the largest port in the world, 42 million containers they did last year. So they ran out of room about 15 years ago on the mainland to service the container ships. So they built a 32-kilometre bridge. It's the longest bridge in the world, going out to a man-made island, which is just basically a container terminal out in the middle of the ocean, where they service, I think they've got about 6 or 7 kilometres of key line, doing 42 million containers per annum. So it's phenomenal, and puts in perspective about our little container terminal down the road. So just a little example of globalisation as far as Adelaide is concerned. I was going to do a wine one, but I decided to do a Harley Davidson one instead. Just explaining how it has become very cheap to supply goods from virtually anywhere in the world. And this is the all-American Harley Davidson. So the wiring comes from Mexico, the seats and the powertrain from the US, tyres from France, brake components from Italy, pistons from Germany, shock absorbers from Japan. I think it's the transmission gears and clutch springs from Taiwan, and Adelaide supplies the wheels. So the landed the landed cost of getting that wheel to Kansas City, I think where they're assembled, is literally $2 per wheel. So it's bugger all in the scheme of things. So, and that's what containerisation has done really. Like, it's just lowered the price. But certain commodities, some businesses don't even bother about the cost of transport. If they're assembling goods from around the world, they treat it as zero because, you know, depending on the value of whatever they're assembling, it really has a little bearing on the cost. That's why I guess world trade has grown the way it has, and a lot of it has to do with something as simple as just the container. The Humboldt shipping container is only a simple metal box, but has transformed global trade. In fact, the containers contributed more to a globalised economy than all of the trade agreements in the past 50 years taken together. And it's probably true. It's made a big, massive difference. And that is it.